Ethan worked in a research center that was always quiet and controlled. Every day he followed the same path, past locked doors and long white halls. The rules of the center were strict. Humans and the visitors were never allowed to break them. There was one rule that stood above all the others. Humans and the visitors could not touch each other, not even by accident. Ethan often wondered about this rule. No one gave a clear answer. The supervisors only said it was for safety, but he never saw proof of danger. To him, it felt like a wall built from fear. Still, he did his work without asking questions. He fixed machines, studied reports, and lived in silence. He thought that was enough, until the day he met Layla. She was different from the others in the center. Her voice was soft and full of calm. Her eyes carried a sadness that was hard to miss. She did not move like someone dangerous. She moved like someone waiting for answers. When Ethan first spoke to her, he kept his distance. But she looked at him as if she wanted to know him, not just his job. It made him uneasy and curious at the same time. One afternoon, when the sun shone through the tall glass walls, Layla asked him the question that no one dared to ask. Her voice was quiet but firm. She asked why they were forbidden from touching humans. She did not ask with anger. She asked with sorrow, like someone who carried the weight of a secret. Ethan froze. He had no real answer. He could repeat the words of the supervisors, but they felt hollow. He looked at her and saw she was waiting for truth, not rules. He tried to explain that the law was made a long time ago, that it was about safety and peace. But as he spoke, he knew his words were empty. Layla's eyes told him she already knew they were empty. She lowered her gaze, and for a moment, the space between them felt heavier than the walls around them. Ethan wanted to step closer, but the rules stood between them like a locked door. Wondered what it would mean if he crossed it. He wondered why fear had more power than kindness. That night, Ethan could not sleep. Her question stayed in his mind. He thought about the walls, the rules, and the silence that filled the center. He thought about how people obeyed without asking why. He realized he had been doing the same. Now he felt restless. Layla's words had opened a crack inside him, and through it, he saw something he had ignored for years. The next morning, he saw Layla again in the corridor. She walked slowly, her head turned toward the ground. Ethan wanted to speak, but he held back. Still, she lifted her eyes and met his. There was no anger in her look, only hope that maybe he had an answer. Ethan felt a strange pull in his chest. It was not desire, not fear, but something in between. It was the weight of a choice. He began to wonder about the past. Had there been a time when rules were different? He thought of old books and hidden files that no one cared about. Maybe the truth was buried there. Maybe the reason for the rule was not what people believed. He told himself he would search. He would find out. Not just for himself, but for Layla, and for the question she carried with so much sadness. In the silence of the research center, Ethan's life had always felt small. But now one simple question had turned it into something larger. Layla had asked why they were forbidden from touching humans. Ethan did not have the answer yet, but he felt he was no longer the same man who once obeyed without thought. The rules still stood, but now there was doubt. Doubt, he realized, was the first step toward change. Ethan spent the next days moving through the center with a restless mind. He did his work as usual, but his thoughts no longer stayed on machines or reports. They wandered back to Layla's question. He felt the weight of her voice each time he remembered her eyes. It was not just a question. It was a wound she carried, and now it had become his too. Late at night, when most of the halls were empty, Ethan walked into the old archive room. It was a place few entered anymore. Shelves stretched high, filled with boxes of paper and thin metal files. Dust lay over everything. The air smelled of silence and forgotten time. He pulled down one box and opened it slowly. Inside were reports from many years ago, records of when the first agreements were made. He read page after page until his eyes blurred. He found stories of another time, long before he was born. There had been friendship between humans and the visitors. They shared meals, stories, and even built things together. The pictures in the old file showed smiling faces, people standing close without fear. Ethan touched one of the photographs and felt a strange warmth. It was proof that the world had once been different. But the records also spoke of one dark day. There had been an accident, though the details were unclear. It was described as a mistake that caused great loss. Fear spread quickly, and leaders decided the safest way forward was to create strict rules. Contact was cut off, and the law of no touch was written. No one had dared to challenge it since. It had become less about truth and more about control. Ethan sat in the quiet archive staring at the pages. He thought of Layla and how she deserved to know this history. He also wondered why so much of it was hidden. The reports were buried in dust, far from the light of day. It was as if someone wanted people to forget. He felt anger rise inside him. Silence had stolen the truth from everyone, including himself. The next morning, Ethan found Layla in the garden near the glass walls. She was sitting alone, her hands folded in her lap. When she saw him, she gave a small nod but said nothing. He sat down across from her, unsure where to begin. For a long time they were quiet, until finally he told her what he had found. He spoke of the old photographs, of the smiles, and of the friendship that had once been real. Layla listened closely, her eyes bright with both hope and sadness. When Ethan told her about the accident and the fear that followed, she lowered her head. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle had been placed in front of her, and she could now see the picture they made. She whispered that fear had stolen their future, and he agreed. He wanted to say more, but words felt small against the weight of history. As the days passed, Ethan and Layla met in secret places of the center. They spoke in low voices, sharing ideas and questions. Each meeting pulled them closer, not in touch, but in spirit. They knew the risk. If they were discovered, punishment would be certain. Still, neither of them turned away. The more they spoke, the more the rule felt like a chain that could no longer hold. Ethan began to dream of change. He imagined a world where the rule was broken, not with anger, but with courage. Layla confessed that she dreamed of the same. She said she did not wish for rebellion or chaos. She wished only for a chance to be seen as equal, not as dangerous. Her words moved Ethan deeply, and he promised himself he would find a way. One evening, as they stood by the tall windows watching the sunset, Layla asked him what he believed. Ethan paused, then said he believed fear had ruled for too long. He believed kindness could be stronger if someone had the courage to show it. Layla smiled faintly, and in her smile, he saw the beginning of something greater than rules. He saw the spark of hope. Their bond grew stronger, and though the law stood firm, they both knew change was possible. The question that Layla had asked was no longer just hers. It was theirs, and together, they carried it forward. The news of Layla and Ethan's quiet meetings did not spread, but the weight of their secret grew heavier each day.
Ow.
Rules pressed against them like walls, and both knew they could not stay hidden forever. Layla often looked toward the high towers where the queen lived, as if her eyes could reach through stone and glass. One evening, she whispered to Ethan that only the queen held the power to end the law. If change was possible, it had to begin with her. Ethan felt fear when he heard her words. The queen was the most guarded figure in the nation. No one approached her without years of service and permission. To request a meeting was close to impossible, and to bring a visitor before her was unthinkable. Still, when he saw the quiet fire in Layla's eyes, he knew she would not let the thought go. She was not asking for rebellion. She was asking for courage. And courage, Ethan realized, was harder to refuse than fear. He began searching for a path, a way into the Queen's court. His work gave him access to old systems and contacts. He sent careful requests, shaped in plain language that did not reveal too much. At night, he studied the Queen's history. He learned about her life before she became a leader. Hidden in the pages of her story, Ethan discovered a truth that cut deep. Long ago, the Queen had loved someone who died in the accident that divided humans and visitors. It was her grief that built the law. It was her loss that shaped the silence. When Ethan shared this with Layla, her eyes filled with sorrow. She said the Queen was not only protecting humans, but protecting her own pain. Ethan listened as Layla spoke softly, saying that wounds carried alone only grow heavier. Perhaps the Queen needed someone brave enough to remind her of kindness. Ethan wondered if they were strong enough for such a task. Layla told him that strength was not in power, but in truth. Days passed before Ethan finally received a small note hidden in his work files. It was short, written with no name. It said there would be an audience. The words shook him, for they meant someone had heard his request. He did not know if it was a gift or a trap, but the chance was there, and chances like this did not come twice. When he told Layla, she did not tremble. Instead, she placed her hand close to his on the table, though the rule kept them from touching. Her voice was steady as she said they would go together. Ethan nodded, though his heart beat with fear. The risk was greater than anything he had faced. Yet the thought of turning back felt heavier than the risk itself. On the morning of the audience, the center was quiet, but inside its silence was a storm. Guards led Ethan and Layla through long corridors toward the grand hall. The walls were high, the ceilings wide, and light poured down from windows above. Everything about the place reminded them of power. Ethan felt small, yet each step made his resolve stronger. Layla walked beside him with calm grace, as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. When the doors opened, Queen Margaret sat upon a high seat carved of stone and wood. Her presence filled the hall, not with anger, but with a weight that pressed into every corner. She looked older than the pictures Ethan had seen, but her eyes were sharp and full of memory. The guards stood still, waiting for her command. Silence wrapped around them all. The Queen's voice was low when she spoke, asking why they had come. Ethan's words stumbled at first, but Layla stepped forward. Her voice was soft yet firm, carrying across the hall. She said they did not come to demand freedom, they came to ask for understanding. She asked why kindness should be forbidden. She asked why fear should rule hearts when hearts long for peace. Her words hung in the air like a fragile thread, yet no one dared cut it. Ethan added his voice, saying the past was heavy, but the future did not have to be chained to it. He told the Queen that silence could not heal pain, only truth could. His words echoed, though he knew they might not be enough. Still, he spoke because the moment demanded courage. The Queen sat still, her hands folded, her face unreadable. But in her eyes, for a brief instant, there was something more than power. It was memory, sorrow, and the shadow of choice. The hall stayed quiet, as if waiting for her heart to speak. Ethan and Layla stood side by side, uncertain of what would come next, yet unwilling to bow to silence any longer. The hall stayed silent after Layla's words, and every breath felt heavy. Queen Margaret leaned back on her seat, her eyes fixed on the two who stood before her. No one else dared to move. The guards waited, their hands close to their sides, ready for any order. But the Queen lifted her hand slightly, keeping them still. Her gaze was sharp, but behind it there was something hidden, something human. She asked Layla to speak again. Her voice was calm, though touched with the weight of years. Layla raised her head and repeated her question, not with force but with quiet strength. She asked why love should be treated as a danger, why kindness should be ruled as forbidden. She said that fear could not heal the world, only courage could. Her words were simple, but they cut deep. Ethan saw that even the guards shifted uneasily, as if the truth in her voice was hard to ignore. Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking at first, then steady. He spoke of the archives he had found, of the pictures of humans standing side by side with visitors without fear. He told of the accident, the one moment that built a wall between them, and how silence had grown into law. He said the Queen had carried her loss with strength, but loss was never meant to chain generations. His words were not loud, but they echoed through the wide hall like a bell. The Queen lowered her eyes for the first time. She did not speak right away. The hall waited, every second longer than the last. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were not hard, but heavy with memory. She said she had loved once, and that love had been taken from her on the day of the accident. Her voice trembled for just a breath, then grew steady again. She said the law was her shield, built to protect others from pain. She believed if no touch was allowed, then no wound would be opened again. Layla bowed her head slightly and spoke with care. She said a shield may guard, but it also keeps out the sun. She said the Queen's pain had built a wall that stopped not only hurt, but also hope. Layla's voice softened as she told her that wounds hidden in silence never heal. They only grow deeper. Ethan watched as the Queen listened, her face unreadable, but her hands gripped the arms of her chair tightly. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Even the air felt still. Ethan added one last thought. He said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to step forward despite it. He said that if humans wished to to lead with wisdom, then they had to lead with compassion. Silence could not honor the past, but compassion could shape the future. His voice cracked at the end, but he did not lower his eyes. For a long time, Queen Margaret said nothing. Then slowly she rose from her seat. The hall shifted as everyone watched. She walked down the steps of her throne, her robes trailing softly against the stone floor. When she stood before Layla and Ethan, her face was close enough for them to see the lines of sorrow that time had drawn. She looked at Layla first, then at Ethan, and finally closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her voice was low, but clear. She said the law had been her burden, carried for too many years. She admitted she feared what would happen if it was broken, but she also admitted that fear had ruled long enough. She turned to her guards and told them to step back. Their hesitation showed their surprise, but they obeyed. The queen's hand trembled slightly. For a moment she looked not like a ruler, but like a woman torn between memory and hope. Layla stood still, waiting, her breath steady. Ethan felt his heart pound as the queen raised her hand slowly, as if fighting with herself. She stopped just short of touching Layla, her fingers hovering in the air. Then she pulled her hand back and turned away. Her voice was heavy as she said she needed time. She could not change the law in a single breath. But she promised she would think, and she would listen. It was the first time in years that she had made such a promise. Ethan and Layla bowed their heads, not in defeat, but in respect. They had not broken the wall, but they had placed the first crack. The queen's heart was no longer closed, and in that small opening, they saw the beginning of hope. As they left the hall, their steps were lighter, though the weight of the future still weighted on their shoulders. Days passed after the audience in the grand hall. The queen gave no orders and no decisions were announced. The silence that followed was heavy, but it carried a different kind of weight now. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of waiting. Ethan and Layla lived each day with unease, wondering if their courage would bring punishment or change. In the garden, under the tall glass walls, they often met in quiet. Layla would sit with her hands resting calmly, and Ethan would speak of small things to ease the tension. But beneath the surface, both of them thought of the queen. What was she deciding in her private chambers? What battle was she fighting within herself? Hope and fear mixed in their hearts, each day stretching longer than the one before. Then, one morning, the sound of bells filled the air. They rang across the city, calling people to gather. The grand square before the queen's hall became crowded with men, women, and children. Guards stood firm, but even they looked uncertain, for no one knew what was to come. Ethan and Layla were brought forward, their steps slow and their eyes wide with both fear and wonder. Queen Margaret appeared on the high balcony, her figure strong against the sky. The crowd fell silent as her voice rose, steady and clear. She spoke of the past, of the day of loss that had shaped the law. She spoke of her grief, and for the first time, her words trembled in public. She admitted that her heart had built a shield of rules to keep the world from breaking again. But in her eyes, she said, she now saw that shields do not heal, they only hide. She looked down at Ethan and Layla. She said they had dared to speak what others were too afraid to say. She said they had reminded her that compassion is stronger than silence. Then she spoke words that no one expected. She declared that the law of no touch was ended. She said healing must begin, and healing cannot live behind fear. The square filled with gasps and cries. People looked at one another, some in disbelief, others with tears in their eyes. The guards themselves stood frozen, unsure how to act without the rule that had guided them for so long. The queen raised her hand, and silence returned. She said there would still be care, still be respect, but no longer chains of fear. The future, she declared, would belong to courage. At her command, Ethan and Layla were led forward to the front of the crowd. The queen's voice softened as she asked them to show the world the meaning of her words. Ethan turned to Layla, his heart pounding louder than the bells. For a moment, he hesitated, as if the invisible wall of the old rule still stood between them. But then he saw the light in her eyes, and the weight of silence broke inside him. Slowly, he lifted his hand. Layla reached out, her fingers trembling yet sure. When their hands touched, the moment felt small and endless all at once. The warmth of her skin and his palm carried more power than any law. It was simple, but it carried the weight of years of fear, broken in an instant. The crowd watched in silence as if they were witnessing history turn. Then, as if a wave passed through the square, people began to cheer. Some wept openly, holding each other, while others reached out their hands in new courage. The air filled with a sound that had not been heard in generations, the sound of hope alive. Ethan held Layla's hand firmly, not as a challenge, but as a promise. They had done nothing more than touch, yet it was everything. Queen Margaret looked down upon them, and though her face was still lined with sorrow, there was a faint smile, gentle and tired but true. She turned and walked back into her hall, leaving the people to shape what would come next. As the crowd slowly parted, Ethan and Layla stood together in the square, hand in hand. The future was unknown, and struggles would still come, but the wall of silence had fallen. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs to walk. And with each step, the memory of that first touch would guide them toward a world where fear no longer ruled, and where hope was strong enough to change everything.